They gave him a borrowed weapon and told him the war was already lost. He used it anyway. His name was Gale Varens, and before the Vareth came, he had been the kind of man other men followed into impossible rooms. Not because he was exceptional, he would have been the first to tell you that, but because he was stubborn in a way that looked, from a distance, like courage. He had a face that had been rearranged by experience. A jaw reset badly after a firefight in the third year of the border campaigns, a scar along his left cheekbone that caught the light wrong and made him look perpetually skeptical. He wore a long field coat, 3 sizes too large for him, one that had belonged to his commanding officer, Commander Rask Varan, before a Vareth neurostrike took Varan apart at the molecular level on the steps of the Meridian Senate. Gale had grabbed the coat from the rubble. He still didn't know why. It didn't fit. It had never fit. He wore it anyway. The Vareth had a name for humans, translated loosely through their acoustic communication matrix. It meant something like, the persistent ones. Not a compliment, more like the way you might describe mold. They had arrived 3 years ago, their transit ships descending through the upper atmosphere, like slow, deliberate accusations. They were not the monsters of old fiction, no tentacles, no slime, no roaring. They were tall and angular, their exoskeletons the color of polished obsidian, their 4-chambered sensory organs tracking movement in spectrums humans had no names for. They communicated through a combination of subsonic resonance and localized electromagnetic pulse that their own biologists called conversation and human neuroscientists called seizure-adjacent. They had conquered 11 worlds before Earth. They had never lost a campaign. They approached human resistance the way a geologist approaches erosion. Something inevitable. Something they could simply wait out. What they had not accounted for was that humans do not erode the same way twice. Gale was sitting on an overturned crate in the middle of Sector 9's refugee camp when he first saw the boy. The camp was in what had once been a covered shopping district, a long, vaulted structure of glass and steel that the Vareth bombardment had left structurally intact, apparently by accident, or perhaps by design. The Vareth had a documented preference for leaving certain human civilian concentrations undisturbed. Command's analyst believed it was a form of psychological pressure. Look, your people survive, we allow it. Try to understand how completely you are at our mercy. The civilians Gale had spoken to had a simpler interpretation. They called it the zoo. He hated the camp. He hated it in the specific way you hate a place, where you don't know the rules, where everyone around you has already built their small economies, and their small hierarchies, and their unspoken arrangements, and you have arrived too late and too wrong to slot yourself anywhere into it. He was a soldier. He understood chain of command, sight lines, perimeter integrity, the specific weight of a decision made under fire. He did not understand how to stand in a queue for reconstituted protein rations, without somehow doing it incorrectly. He did not understand why the civilians looked at his too large coat and his soldier's bearing, and stepped slightly away from him, the way people step away from something that reminds them of something they are trying to forget. He sat on his crate and tried to look like he was not lost. That was when the boy came and sat down 3 feet away from him and stared. The boy was 9, maybe 10. Hard to tell. Malnutrition compressed kids in ways that confused Gale's estimates. He was wearing an adult's military-issue jacket, the kind the Resistance had standardized before the Meridian collapse. It was enormous on him. The sleeves covered his hands completely. The hem came down past his knees. He had folded the cuffs back 4 times and they were still loose. He sat in that jacket with the particular dignity of someone who has been told, implicitly or explicitly, to take it off, and has refused. Gale recognized that. He recognized it in his blood. "Your father's?" Gale asked. The boy, his name turned out to be Sue, pronounced like the word for breath in a language Gale didn't speak, looked at him for a long moment before nodding once. "Where is he?" Another pause. "He was at Meridian." Gale didn't say anything after that. There was nothing to say after that. He sat on his crate, and the boy sat in his dead father's jacket, and the camp moved around them both. And the late afternoon light came through the cracked glass vaulting overhead in long amber shafts, and for a while that was enough. He had come to Sector 9 because Command had sent him, and Command had sent him because he was inconvenient elsewhere. That was the honest version. The official version was that Gale Varens, formerly of the Meridian Rapid Response Corps, decorated 4 times, broken twice, was being assigned to Sector 9 as a liaison and tactical assessment officer, reporting directly to the regional resistance cell operating out of the old public transit infrastructure beneath the camp. The subtext, which everyone involved understood perfectly well, was that Gale Varens had become a problem. Not a discipline problem. He followed orders, mostly, when the orders made sense. The problem was that he had survived Meridian when he shouldn't have. He had led a rearguard action through 6 kilometers of occupied city with 11 soldiers and gotten 7 of them out. He had done this wearing the dead commander's coat and carrying a sidearm and not much else. He had done this by making decisions that violated at least 4 standard engagement protocols and worked anyway. Command's analysts didn't know what to do with that. They didn't know how to classify it. They had promoted him and then moved him somewhere quiet. The way you move an artifact you don't know how to appraise into a side room. The resistance cell beneath Sector 9 was run by a woman named Ira Solis. She was small and precise in the way that very dangerous things are small and precise. And she had the kind of patience that comes not from serenity but from having made peace with the idea that most plans fail, and you simply make a new one. She had operated under Vareth occupation for 14 months. She had 3 kills against Vareth ground commanders, which was 3 more than anyone else in the regional network could claim. She wore her hair short and her expression neutral, and she had a way of looking at you that made you feel she was running a rapid assessment, cataloging useful attributes and areas of risk, filing you under a category, and moving on. She looked at Gale for about 4 seconds and said, "You're going to be a problem." "I've been told," he said. "Not an insult. Problems are interesting." She handed him a tablet. "The Vareth have positioned a forward command unit 3 kilometers northwest of here. Standard configuration, 2 hard guards, 1 command class architect, and a support array we believe is tasked with coordinating the next sector sweep. If that sweep happens, this camp gets classified as cleared." You know what cleared means. He knew what cleared meant. It meant the Vareth had decided the psychological utility of the zoo had run its course. 14 hours, she said. "That's the window our signals analyst has estimated before the sweep protocols engage. I have 12 fighters available, none of them trained against hard guard armor, and a collection of captured small arms that will, at best, irritate a standard guard unit." Gale looked at the tablet. He looked at the disposition of the Vareth unit. He looked at the camp schematic, and the civilian distribution, and the exits and the sight lines. He thought about Meridian. He thought about Raskvoron's coat hanging off his shoulders. "You need a distraction," he said. "I need a miracle," she said. "But I'll take a distraction." What Ira had not told him in that initial briefing, what she revealed 3 hours later when she apparently decided she trusted him enough, was the device. It had been recovered from a Vareth crash site 6 weeks prior. The Varath called it, in acoustic translation, something like the carrier. A resonance amplifier designed to interface with Varath exoskeleton combat suits, boosting their neurostrike capacity by a factor of 5. In Vareth hands it was a force multiplier of devastating efficiency. In human hands it was inert. The activation protocol required a specific bioelectric frequency that no human nervous system naturally produced. Or so the Varath had assumed. Ira's signals analyst, a former biophysicist named Doman who had not slept a full night since the occupation began, had spent 3 weeks reverse engineering the activation interface. He had found something the Varath had not accounted for because it hadn't occurred to them to look for it. Human emotional response generated bioelectric spikes of a very specific, very chaotic, very high-amplitude character. Fear did it, grief did it, rage did it. But the highest amplitude spike, the cleanest, the most sustained, the one that most closely matched the carrier frequency the carrier needed, was something else. Something the Vareth had no word for, because they had no experience of it. Their socio-biological structure was collective and hierarchical. Their emotional range, such as it was, ran towards calculation and threat assessment. They had no analog for what happened in a human nervous system when someone you loved believed in you out loud. Encouragement. The specific voltage of being told, by someone whose opinion matters to you, that you are enough, that you will not fail, that they are watching and they are certain. Doman had run the numbers 17 times because he didn't believe them the first 16. The bioelectric signature of sincere human encouragement, focused on a single recipient directed through the carrier's interface, it matched. Not perfectly. Enough. "You want me to use a Vareth weapon," Gale said. "I want you to use a human weapon," Doman said. "That happens to look like a Vareth weapon." He sat in the prep space beneath the transit tunnels and looked at the carrier. It was a dense, angular thing designed for Vareth physiology, and holding it felt wrong in the specific way that borrowed things feel wrong, functional but alien, shaped for hands that weren't his. He thought about Rask Voron's coat. He thought about Sue's dead father's jacket, sleeves folded back 4 times, still too long. Maybe that was the human condition, he thought. Wearing things that don't fit quite right. Carrying on anyway. He put the carrier's interface harness on, and it sat awkwardly on his shoulders, and he left it there. He found Sue at the edge of the camp, sitting on a concrete barrier where the vaulted glass structure gave way to open sky. Or what passed for sky in Sector 9, which was a gray-brown atmosphere thick with particulate from the bombardment, occasionally streaked with the light trails of Vareth atmospheric skimmers. The boy was watching the skimmers the way children watch things that frighten them, but that they refuse to look away from. Confrontational watching. The watching of someone who has decided that looking at the thing directly is a form of defiance. Gale sat next to him without asking permission. "You should go to the interior shelter when the alarm sounds," Gale said. "Not the south entrance. Northwest corridor, 3rd junction. The structural integrity assessment says that corner of the building will hold even under grade 3 bombardment." Sue looked at him. "Are you going out there?" "Yes." "Why?" Gale thought about that. He could give the strategic answer. The sweep, the window, the necessity of disrupting the Varath command array before it coordinated the sector clearance. He could give the soldier's answer. Because somebody has to, and I've been pointed in this direction. He could give the honest answer, which was messier and harder and truer than both of those. "Because the camp is full of people in jackets that don't fit them anymore," he said. "And I think that's worth protecting." Sue looked at him for a long time. Then he looked back at the skimmers. "My father said, the Varath don't understand we fight when we're losing," the boy said. "He said that was the thing they kept getting wrong about us. They kept expecting us to stop." Gale didn't say anything. He didn't stop, so said. It wasn't pride. It was something more complicated than pride. Grief that had been turned, through some alchemy of necessity, into a statement of fact. He didn't stop. As if that mattered. As if that was enough to say. Gale stood up. He adjusted the carrier's interface harness on his shoulders. The weight of it had started to feel slightly less wrong. "Neither will I," he said. The operation had a name. Ira had named it. Because Ira named everything, a habit she had developed as a memory technique in the early occupation, when written records were too dangerous to keep. She called it fold back. The logic being, you take what the enemy made to use against you, fold it back on itself, and use it against them. Gale ran it through his head 3 times in the approach through the Northwest Transit tunnels, while Ira's 12 fighters moved in a loose formation around him. The carrier sat on his back. Doman had reconfigured the interface as well as he could for human physiology, which was to say, imperfectly, with apologies. The activation threshold required the bioelectric spike. Without it, the device was dead weight. With it, theoretically, it would discharge a resonance pulse of sufficient amplitude to overload a hardguard's exoskeleton and, if aimed correctly, compromise the command class architect's communication array. Theoretically. The practical problem was that Gale couldn't manufacture the bioelectric spike himself. Doman had explained this with the careful patience of a scientist delivering bad news. Self-directed emotional generation didn't produce the right waveform. It needed to come from outside. It needed to be received, not generated. The subject needed to be the object of the encouragement, not the source of it. "So I need someone to believe in me," Gale had said. To a clinically measurable degree, Doman had said. Yes, he had not told Ira or Doman about his conversation with Sue. He didn't see how to explain it without sounding like a man who had lost his perspective. He filed it under, "Figure it out in the field." The first hard guard they encountered was standing at the perimeter of the Vareth command position, its exoskeleton cycling through its standard patrol rhythm. A slow, terrible economy of movement that always reminded Gale of a machine that had been designed by something that found waste offensive. The guard was 4 meters tall at full extension. Its neurostrike emitters were positioned at shoulder height, which at full charge could drop an unshielded human at 30 meters and scatter a fire team at 50. Ira's fighters went for the support array first as planned. Clean, coordinated, the kind of tactical movement that Gale recognized as the product of months of drilling under conditions that would have broken most professional soldiers. He watched them move with something that was not quite pride and not quite envy, more like recognition. People who had refused to stop. He moved wide and came at the hard guard from the northeast. which put the command-class architect in his sightline at a range of approximately 40 meters. The carrier's interface harness was warm against his shoulders, still inert. He needed the spike. The hard guard found him at 32 meters. Its sensory array oriented toward him with that horrible mechanical precision, tracking him the way a weapon tracks a target. Not because it was hunting him, but because he had entered a category, and the category response was automatic. The neurostrike emitters began their charge cycle. Gale had approximately 4 seconds before discharge. He didn't run. He stood in the dead commander's coat and the Vareth's borrowed weapon on his back, and he thought, "This is the part where someone believes in you." And then he heard it. It was Sue's voice. The boy had not gone to the northwest corridor. He was at the edge of the perimeter. How he had gotten there, how he had followed, Gale would spend a considerable amount of subsequent time being furious about. Standing on a piece of broken concrete that gave him a sightline, wearing his father's jacket with the sleeves folded back 4 times, and he was shouting something that in the chaos and distance and the building charge, whine of the neurostrike emitters resolved itself, by the time it reached Gale's ears, into 3 words: "He's not stopping." The bioelectric spike hit Gale's nervous system like a door opening onto bright light. He felt it as heat first, not pain, or not only pain, a wave of something that had no good scientific name and every good human one. The carrier's interface harness went from warm to incandescent. Doman's calibrations caught the waveform and held it, and the device came alive in a way that Gale felt in his back teeth. A vibration that had no analog in any human technology he had ever encountered. He had 4 seconds, and he used one of them to make sure his aim was right. The resonance pulse discharged outward in a focused cone that the Vareth engineers had designed for exoskeleton to exoskeleton combat, which meant it was calibrated specifically to interact with Vareth armor frequencies. At 4 meters, the hard guard's exoskeleton seized, every joint locked simultaneously, every emitter cycling into emergency shutdown, the entire terrible economy of its movement arrested in a single involuntary stillness. It stayed standing. It would stay standing for another 30 seconds before the neuromuscular interface failed, and it went down. 30 seconds that Gale didn't need. He was already moving toward the architect. The command class were different from the guards. Gale had studied their profiles extensively in the months after Meridian, when studying things had been the only activity that kept his mind from a place he didn't want it to go. The architects were the thinkers of the Vareth ground operation. Smaller than the guards, faster, their exoskeletons built for processing and coordination rather than combat. They had 4 sensory organs, and they used them all simultaneously, which made them extraordinarily difficult to approach unseen. They also, according to Command's intelligence, had a dedicated escape protocol. If the perimeter was compromised, an architect would withdraw before committing to engagement, because architects were resources, and Vareth Command did not waste resources. This one didn't withdraw. It turned to face him. That surprised him. He slowed, just fractionally. The architect's acoustic matrix opened. Its version of speech, a subsonic vibration that humans felt more than heard, translated through the device Doman had built into Gale's earpiece as something like, "You are one. The weight of what you carry is not your own." This is known. He stopped entirely. It was possible, he realized, that the Vareth had been watching him for longer than he'd known, tracking the coat, tracking the borrowed weapon, building a psychological profile. They were good at that. Calibrating pressure to the specific load-bearing points of the individual. The command class especially. The architect was telling him, "We see you. We see the dead man's coat, and the borrowed device, and the soldier who survived when he shouldn't have, and carries the weight of that. We see how poorly it fits you. We are offering you the moment when you put it down." He stood in the amber-gray light of the occupied sector, and the weight of everything he carried settled on his shoulders like it always did, like it had since Meridian. And he thought about what Sue had said. He didn't stop. He thought about Rask Voron, who he had never liked very much, but who had died anyway trying to shield his people, and that had to count for something, that had to go somewhere. All that trying had to accumulate somewhere in the universe, even if you couldn't point to the place. He thought about 12 fighters who had drilled for months in tunnels, under an occupied city. He thought about a boy standing on a piece of broken concrete with his father's jacket sleeves folded back 4 times, shouting at a war. The carrier's interface was still warm. Doman had been uncertain whether the device could discharge a second pulse within the operational window without recalibration. Gale had filed this under, "Figure it out in the field." He brought it to bear on the architect and it discharged. The pulse was weaker than the first. Doman had been right to be uncertain. But the architect's communication array was not armored the way the hard guard's exoskeleton was. It was an instrument of precision rather than endurance, and what the pulse lacked in amplitude, it made up for in specificity, finding the array's resonant frequency the way water finds a crack and follows it down. The array collapsed inward. The architect staggered. It had a sense of balance that, like many things about it, had never been designed with the possibility of failure in mind. Without the communication array, it was severed from the broader Vareth coordination network. The sweep protocols had no coordinator to execute them. 14 hours became something else. 14 hours became a window that Ira's cell could use to move the camp, to rebuild the perimeter, to do what surviving populations do when they are given time. Survive a little longer and make plans. The architect fell. Gale stood in the wreckage of the command position and breathed. The carrier's interface was cold now, spent its resonance matrices exhausted. He unclipped the harness and let it down slowly because it deserved that. It had done what he'd asked of it, even though it hadn't been made for him. He laid it on the ground with a care he couldn't entirely account for. He looked up and Sue was there, at the edge of the position, still wearing the jacket with the folded sleeves, and his expression was the complicated thing again. Not triumph, not celebration, something more durable than both of those. "You didn't stop," the boy said. Gale looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the dead command position, at the collapsed array, at the hard guard still locked in its involuntary stillness, at the camp 3 kilometers southeast which was still there, at Ira's 12 fighters, all of them upright, conducting immediate post-action security, with the calm efficiency of people who had long since stopped being surprised when plans worked. "Neither did you," Gale said. He walked to the boy and crouched down so they were eye level, which required an uncomfortable arrangement of his knees but seemed important. He looked at the jacket, at the sleeves folded back 4 times. "That's a good jacket," he said. Sue looked down at it, then back up at him. "It doesn't fit," he said. "No," Gale agreed. He straightened up, and the dead commander's coat settled on his shoulders the way it always did. Never quite right. Always there. They never do at first. They walked back to the camp together, in the gray-brown afternoon light, and behind them the Verth command in position sat silent for the first time in months, its communication array unable to reach the ships in the upper atmosphere, unable to coordinate the sweep, unable to deliver the accumulated weight of a species that had conquered 11 worlds on the assumption that persistence was their singular attribute. It wasn't, that was the miscalculation. It had always been the miscalculation. The Varath had named humans the persistent ones, and they had meant it as a category, as a property, as something observable from outside and therefore containable. What they had not understood, what their 11 prior campaigns had not equipped them to understand, was that human persistence was not a constant. It was not the dull, mechanical endurance of something that simply failed to break. It was renewed continuously by contact, by transmission, by the specific electricity of one person looking at another person and saying, in whatever words or no words at all, "I see you carrying that. Keep going." That was not something you could map, not something you could model, not something you could find in a bioelectric scan of a single nervous system operating in isolation. You could find it, though, if you had the right instrument, and you were paying attention. The Varath were good at a great many things. They had not, in 11 prior campaigns, been required to pay attention to that particular frequency. They would need to adjust their models. Ira met them at the camp perimeter. She looked at Gale, then at Sue, then at the cold and empty carrier hanging from Gale's hand. "How?" she said. Gale thought about how to explain Doman's biophysics, and the activation threshold, and the waveform characteristics of sincere encouragement, and a boy on a piece of broken concrete with his father's jacket sleeves folded back 4 times. The weapon needed the right input, he said. Ira looked at him with her 4-second assessment gaze. Then she looked at Sue. Then she almost smiled, which on her face was the equivalent of a standing ovation. "Get some rest," she said. "We have 14 hours to move 2,000 people, and I need you functional." Gale nodded. He looked at Sue. "Northwest corridor," he said. "Third junction." "I know," Sue said. "I found it earlier." Gale started to say something about perimeter discipline and following operational guidance and not trailing armed personnel into active combat zones. Then he stopped. He looked at the boy in the too large jacket, standing at the edge of a camp that was still there because a borrowed weapon had fired when someone believed in the person holding it. "Good," he said instead. Stay close to the corner. He walked into the camp, and the gray-brown light followed him in, and somewhere above the cracked glass vaulting, the Vareth atmospheric skimmers continued their slow circuits, their sensory arrays calibrated to 17 spectrums, and blind as stone to the one that mattered.